Now that we've seen what the research says that the writing process is and what it looks like in practice, it's time for us to think about how to apply what we've talked about here to your classroom and your instruction. In the activity you did in Unit 4, you used a rubric to identify the strengths in your students' writing, as well as the areas in which they may need some help. Rather than simply providing students with that constructive feedback, you can also use that important data to inform your instruction so that you can help your students improve their writing. You want to be very intentional in how you translate what you learn from using the rubric into classroom instruction. The best way to do that is to create a formal lesson plan that addresses the things that came up as you looked at your students' writing. The development process for creating the lesson plan will give you the opportunity to really consider how to incorporate the need to help students improve in certain areas in your instruction without turning the class into a grammar class that only involves drills. It also allows you to think about how to draw on students' strengths to help them scaffold their knowledge. You've been provided, and see on this slide, a lesson plan template. If you've written a lesson plan before, this may look familiar. However, to make sure that we're all on the same page and familiar with all the components of a lesson plan, let's go through this briefly now. Under Lesson Topic, you specify the topic of the lesson. You can be creative and give it a fun title, or you can keep it simple. Just make sure that it's descriptive enough to remind you of what is being covered. Under Lesson Objective, you specify what the objective is for the lesson. What do you want students to get out of the lesson? All lesson plans are part of a series, and this is especially true in writing. Rarely is writing taught in isolation. It tends to be taught in connection with reading or a speaking and listening practice or something else you've been doing in class. Under Lessons Connection with Previous Work, you would specify what that connection is to help remind you of how it fits into the bigger picture. Under Key Writing Structure, specify what writing issues you want to include in the lesson. Having it there provides a quick reference for you as you work through the development of the lesson. In this lesson plan, a writing structure might include an aspect of the revision stage, such as organization and content, or it might include a grammar structure, such as the passive voice. Under Key Vocabulary, you can list any terms that you want to make sure to cover in this lesson. Now, let's look at the stages of the lesson plan. In warm-up review, students use their prior knowledge to preview or review material related to the lesson. The introduction should be a picture, story, or series of questions or other device that focuses students' attention on the upcoming lesson or learning objective. During the presentation, the teacher models, demonstrates, explains, and works with the new language, concepts, or skills. Next, you do a comprehension check to check students' understanding of the material. Next are the two practice stages of the lesson plan: guided practice and communicative practice. Guided practice is a highly structured practice activity that allows students to work with the new language, concepts, and skills while building accuracy. In writing, guided practice may be a fill-in exercise or a paragraph frame. Communicative practice involves interactive practice activities, often task-based, that integrate the new material with newly acquired language and build students' fluency. A communicative practice activity is more open-ended than a guided practice activity. It involves applying what they learned in guided practice. It's an in-class practice that builds on the guided practice where students work individually, in pairs, or in partners with no scaffolding involved. Then you do an evaluation, which can be done through teacher observation, performance-based assessments, paper and pencil tests, or another activity that assesses students' growth and attainment of the objective. Last is the application stage, which is an opportunity for students to use what they've learned in the lesson to communicate in a new, real-life situation, another context, or in another proficiency area. Keep in mind, that not all lesson plans necessarily include every single stage, but it's important to be aware of what the various stages are so that you can appropriately incorporate them into your lesson plans as needed. These definitions have been included in the lesson plan document as a quick reference for you of the stages of the lesson plan in case you would like to remind yourself of what they mean later. Writing a lesson plan can be a very daunting task. Writing a lesson plan that effectively incorporates data can be even more challenging. As part of activity number 3, you will be taking on the task of writing a lesson plan. But to help you ease into it, let's look at a sample lesson plan and how it is created step by step. The sample lesson plan you were provided and see here is from Jennifer Glass, the ABE intermediate teacher whose rubric was included as a sample in Unit 4. One area that she found students needed help with was error correction. Her students also seemed to have a hard time with active and passive voice. Imagine that in her class, the students have been working on different types of business writing. They've worked on resumes and cover letters, and Jennifer decides to work on memos next. She has started creating a lesson plan by filling out the lesson plan template. This sample lesson plan focuses on error correction and active and passive voice. Since the students will be working on memo writing during this lesson, she put that under topic. Now, look at lesson objective. The objective of the lesson is for students to be able to recognize proper memo format and correct common errors of content and grammar to write a clear memo. This objective includes both content and a writing skill. Jennifer clearly lays out how this lesson ties into the other work they've been doing in class. Students have been doing error correction on their own work. We've been talking about different types of business writing. The writing structure she wants to cover is active voice versus passive voice. An example of active voice would be, I am writing a memo. An example of passive voice would be, the memo was written by Tom, or a problem was brought to my attention. Please note that a writing structure could include a grammar point or a paragraph element such as introduction, body, or conclusion of a paragraph. She has listed the vocabulary she wants to cover as a reminder to bring up these terms as they go through the lesson. Now, let's look at the lesson itself. What does she want to do for warm-up? For the warm-up, Jennifer plans to survey students about their experience writing and receiving memos, and then chart the answers to show the percentages of students who have or haven't written or received a memo. This is a fun activity that gets students to start thinking about memos. Next, she plans to introduce the idea of a memo by analyzing the parts of the memo. She will show her students what she hopes they'll be able to do by the end of the lesson. She also takes this opportunity to introduce some of the vocabulary and key components she wants to cover. Jennifer's plan for the presentation stage highlights that this portion of the lesson is supposed to present the information and isn't limited to the teacher standing in the front of the class and giving a presentation. Instead, students will be using teamwork to learn the rules for writing a memo, which will help them to meet the lesson's objectives. She will integrate writing and error correction into the activity by having them identify examples of each rule. During the comprehension check, she will have students work on error correction with sentences that break the writing rules, sentences which will give them the opportunity to work on one of the areas she identified from analyzing the rubric patterns. Again, using teamwork to provide instruction, Jennifer will have them do more editing and error correction during the first activity of the guided practice stage. Don't forget that using the patterns noted on the rubrics, she also identified passive voice as an area that students need some work on. She includes an activity on that here that ties into the topic of memo writing while having students improve this aspect of their writing. For the communicative practice, Jennifer plans to have students do a writing activity that involves writing a memo, applying what they have learned about how to do it. Next is the evaluation stage. She asks students to exchange memos and evaluate their peers. She will review the memos herself after the class to review students' writing, but this activity will also allow her to further evaluate students' understanding of the rules based on the feedback they provide. Finally, for the application stage, Jennifer will have the class create a memo together that one student writes down, and then we'll have them discuss how to present their memo.